Good morning. My name is Kevin Goodwin. I'm the next generation pastor here at the Beaumont campus. Good morning, North. Good morning to those who are watching on Facebook Live, and happy first Sunday of the new year. We're going to be looking at Luke chapter 20, starting in verse 9 this morning, and as you're turning there, I'll say Happy New Year again and give you some good news. Would you like some good news for the new year? Would you like some good news for the new year? Yeah, okay. I'm hearing yeses, so I'll just say it. This past week, January 2nd through the 4th, there were 40,000 college-age students and young adults that gathered together to spend the first week of their new year, the first week of 2019, worshiping God in stadiums all across the United States. It's a conference called Passion Conference, and we like to get down on the millennials and the Generation Zers, but there are bright spots of hope for your future. That is your good news. There are those that are following hard after God with a passion and a desire for Him in every aspect of their lives. And we got to see that for a little bit this week. It was a great thing to be a part of. Just got back on Friday. And so I'm telling you that because there is also good news for this morning. You've made it probably to Luke chapter 20, that section right there, and you've seen that title, right? That gloss in some of your translations that says, The Parable of the Wicked Tenants. And now you're saying, Kevin, great choice, great passage, great way to start off the new year. It's a real downer. Parable of the Wicked Tenants, that's how you want to start us off for the year. But I'm going to suggest something, okay? I'm going to suggest something this morning that we look at it not as the parable of the wicked tenants. The tenants are a side character, right? They're in the way of the truth of this parable. What this parable is really about is the beloved son. The parable of the beloved Son that God sends, that God continually pursues us through His action. We're going to talk about how this parable shows that God has sent over time throughout history prophets and those to be His mouthpiece to people so that they could respond. And over again we have rejected, we have misunderstood, we have run, and He has pursued us. He has sought our welfare as a part of seeking His own glory by saving us, by showing the majesty of who He is, by defeating death and sin and the grave through Jesus so that we could have this relationship with Him. So the sermon and the sentence for this morning is throughout history, God has acted and moved to save you and to save me for His glory. And we're going to talk about that this morning in Luke chapter 20, starting in verse 9. Luke chapter 20, starting in verse 9. Y'all read with me. And He began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went into another country for a long while. When the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, but they also beat and treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent yet a third. This one they also wounded and cast out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him. But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, This is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours. And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, Surely not. But he looked directly at them and said, What then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. Let's pray. Father God, I pray that you would illuminate this text for us this morning. God, I pray that you would guide our thoughts, guide them ever unto you. And God, that you would show us that you have worked throughout time and history, God, to save us, to secure our salvation through your Son. God, I pray that we would, those of us who come in contact with that truth for the first time this morning, that would respond. And for those of us that know it and know it well, would live in such a way that our active, faithful obedience shows it outside of this place. It's in your Son's name we pray these things. Amen. So in Luke chapter 20, we see the continuation of Luke's message. This Gospel of Luke is, again, centered on a lot of reversals, a lot of unexpected things happening, right? Jesus hangs out with people we don't expect him to hang out with. Jesus says a lot of things to religious leaders that the religious leaders aren't expecting to hear. And he says a lot of things about what it means to be truly faithful, truly obedient, truly fruitful, that we don't also expect to hear. And in the midst of this interchange with the chief priests and scribes and elders that have come up to him and started questioning him, he tells this parable. And they start to begin to question him with the context of chapter 19, chapter 20, chapter 21, as we've just had the triumphal entry, right? In chapter 19, we've just had Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, not understanding those in leadership, and yes, those who are a part of the temple worship, not understanding who Jesus is, and he weeps because they have misunderstood. They have not seen the time of their visitation and known by whom they are visited. And then we have the cleansing of the temple at the end of chapter 19. He enters the temple, begins to drive those out who sold, saying to them, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." And in my mind, I think of it, when I picture it, incorrectly, I think of it this way, that Jesus comes in, he wrecks shop in the temple, he's turning over tables, and he's saying, he's pronouncing these things against them. My house is supposed to be a house of prayer, you've turned it into a den of robbers. And then he wipes his hands and walks off. And now it's time to go on to the next thing. But that's not what he does. What happens in the next verse, right after the cleansing of the temple, verse 47, "And he was teaching daily in the temple. The chief priests and the scribes and the principal men of the people were seeking to destroy them, but they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were hanging on his words." They were hearing truth for the first time probably ever in their lifetimes in that space, and they were hanging on his words. And what Jesus had done is not just to cleanse the temple, but he began to use it for the purpose that it was intended for. To preach restoration and redemption and truth and justice and real righteousness that comes not from following laws, but comes from faith in the beloved Son. And so at the beginning of chapter 20, they see their world being upended, right? They see all of these things that they've placed their faith in and their ability to attain their own righteousness, which is false. And they get scared, they get worried, and they ask him at the beginning of chapter 20. One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple, preaching the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came up to him and said, "Tell us by what authority you teach these things. Tell us by what authority you do this, or who gave you this authority." And Jesus, in a very Jesus way, answers their question with a question. Well, was the baptism of John the Baptist, the one who would come and be a voice crying out in the wilderness and prepare the way of the Lamb of God who would come to take away the sins of the world, that John the Baptist, was the baptism of repentance that John the Baptist was preaching, was that from heaven or from man? And then we get their immediate response, not with their words, but with what they do. Was the baptism of John the Baptist from heaven, or was it from man? And then they discuss among themselves. They get in their little corners. What are we going to say? And they come up with this huge gem of a non-response, right? Well, if we say it was from heaven, you're probably going to ask us, why didn't you believe him? Because we didn't. We didn't believe him. If we say that it's from man, all these people are going to be ticked and start throwing rocks at us because they believe he's a prophet. They know it's from heaven. So here's our response, Jesus. You ready? I don't know. That's what they decided to say. And so his response to them has the same hint of irony. Well, neither will I tell you by which authority I do these things. And then he proceeds to tell a parable that tells exactly the authority that is his, as the beloved Son sent by the Father to preach in a new way, to teach in a new way, but not just words, not just principles, not just actions, but to change the course of history on the cross. And not end it at the cross, but in the empty tomb. so that he could prove his authority, not just by the things that he says, but by pointing to the testimony of the Father that sent him. Now, the priests and the scribes and the elders have played their hand already, right? Before they even speak, we know where their authority comes from, because their response is to immediately consult among themselves, right? I need to be the most popular answer here. I need to give the thing that's going to get me in the least amount of trouble. I need to be that Jell-O that you can't really nail to the wall and get out of this thing. Jesus, I don't know. I don't know if it was from heaven or it was from man. I don't want to say something that's going to get me in trouble. Because they are ultimately concerned not with actual authority, but with the appearance of authority. And that's really what they're concerned about with what Jesus is teaching. Their appearance of authority is dwindling, it's disappearing. Because the one who has the words of life is preaching and teaching in the temple, and they're scared. They're afraid. Because again, their authority lies elsewhere. They have not recognized the time of their visitation, and the one who has come to set all things right is despised and rejected, and they give him no authority. There was a recent study out of Bielefeld University in Germany that claims that children, specifically 7 to 9-year-olds, are having a crisis of authority. What voice do we listen to? And you might be surprised the competing voices that they are listening to. Here's what the study was. They were put in a room with other 7 to 9-year-olds, and they were told to look at a computer screen and to put in order vertical lines that were different links. They were told they could click and they could put them wherever they wanted to on their screen and put them in order from shortest to longest line. And so there was one group that was completely made out of 7 to 9-year-olds, and they did pretty well. It was pretty easy. It's not a test to test their vision. It's a test to test where they place their authority. And so they pretty much got it right. They put them all in the same order. It's a pretty easy test. But there was another group. That's a control group, right? That's to make sure that 7 to 9-year-olds can actually do this, and they were able to do it pretty efficiently. The control group did it pretty efficiently. The other group had a mysterious addition. And it was a robot programmed by a computer. Now, everybody in both groups can see each other's screens, right? So you can see if you're the odd man out. You can see if maybe you didn't measure up to everybody else. In the groups with the robot was intentionally programmed to give the wrong answer, to put them in the wrong order. Do you know what percentage of 7 to 9-year-olds, knowing they had the right answer, and seeing a robot give a different answer, change their answer? 75%. 75% of 7 to 9-year-olds trust a robot's opinion just on the fact that it's a robot more than their own. Now, they did the test with adults. Adults were a lot better at disagreeing with the technology. But if you're thinking about 7 to 9-year-olds, these are kids who know no world without an iPhone, know no world without an iPad. What I read on the internet is true, right? Don't trust everything you read on the internet. Abraham Lincoln, right? That old quote. And so it's scary, right? That should scare us. That we are continually giving over the authority to our screens just because it's a screen, right? It should be scary. It should be scary to the Pharisees that they realize that their authority is misplaced. See, for us, it's this technological wonder that we fear. For them, it was losing some semblance of authority that they never had in the first place because it belongs to the one who is in powerful pursuit of us. And Jesus proves it with this story. We'll talk about 3 ways that happens this morning. First of which is that God has moved throughout history to save us, this salvation history that we talk about, this progressive revelation of not only God through Jesus, but God's plan and actions in the world. We will learn that nothing thwarts this purpose. This has been purpose since the foundation of the earth. And nothing is going to stand in the way of what God desires to do on behalf of me and on behalf of you. And we have a response to this. God calls us to faithfulness. This was not done for no reason. God calls us to a faithfulness that brings others along in that journey with us. And so let's look at these three things really quickly this morning. First of which, God has moved throughout history to save us. It's this image of God in pursuit of us. Even when we run in the other direction, even when we reject completely his message to us, God pursues us, seeks after us. And we see this in the story this morning in the fact that the prophets were rejected. These servants, at the beginning of this parable, in verse 10, when the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, but they also beat him and treated him shamefully, sent him away empty-handed. And yet a third servant was sent. This one they wounded and cast out. These are the prophets that were sent beforehand to proclaim the message of salvation, of the Messiah, that were not received. Not only were they not received, they were beaten, they were cast out. Not only were they beaten and cast out, Matthew's version of the story even kills, which is true if you know your Old Testament history. They were rejected. Their message as God's mouthpiece was also rejected. This image of prophets as servants is relatively prevalent in the Old Testament. Jeremiah, 2 Kings, Amos calls prophets servants or even slaves. Moses, Joshua, Elijah are all called servants themselves specifically in their prophetic role. In fact, earlier in Luke, Jesus even talks about the prophets, what's connected to the woe to the Pharisees section in Matthew, some of the things that Jesus is saying against the leadership, the religious leadership of the time. He says, you have built tombs for the prophets, right? In chapter 11. The implication being that you should have listened to them. You have connected yourself to your ancestors who've rejected their message, not only rejected their message, but killed them. And you should have listened. Here's what you have chosen instead of it. You've chosen to tithe mint and dill and herbs from your garden and neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and righteousness. You have chosen to strain gnats out of the things that you drink because they're unclean. And with the way that you live, with the way that you act, with the things that you neglect, you're basically swallowing camels. Another unclean animal that makes you just as unclean. You are like unmarked graves. People walk over you and don't realize it. Which sounds spooky to us, but there is another deeper meaning to it. Because to come in contact with the corpse made you unclean. And so you religious leaders who are supposed to be leading the people in right worship, leading the people in righteousness and faithfulness and fruitfulness, just by coming into contact with you, they become unclean. That is the choice that you have made. Because you have rejected over and over and over again God's action on your behalf. But it's not just the leaders. It's Israel completely. See, Jesus begins this conversation at the beginning of chapter 20 with the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. But look in verse 9. Who does he tell it to? The people. Everybody. Those who previously were hanging on his word. When he tells them exactly what's going to happen, when he tells them that the vineyard, those in charge, will be overthrown and will be given to others, they have a response that is not accepting. We'll talk about that in a second. And ultimately, this God in pursuit narrative throughout this parable points us to the fact that the Son, the beloved Son, is the ultimate authority. The ones who the the tenants have decided to kill so that they may gain some inheritance. It was part of the plan. He was sent to die. Guess what? So that you could be made sons and daughters, so that you could receive the inheritance that you seek by ill-gotten means. Because it's not up to you. It's not according to your plan. It's been the Father's plan to redeem you all along. And nothing, not even your rejection, thwarts that purpose. Not even your outright rebellion can stop it. You see, when we look at the way in these verses, we're going to skip down to the last part of verse 16 and verse 17, and then we'll talk about that middle section at the very end. We look at the way that the story is told. We see this misunderstanding and selfishness, yes, on behalf of the religious leaders, but also on behalf of the people. When Jesus tells a story, he tells exactly what's going to happen to these who decided to kill the heir and try to get their inheritance. What will the owner of the vineyard do to them? Verse 16, he will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, "Surely not. Surely not." Now, he's telling this story to the people, and the people are the one who are responding. Surely not. That's not how it's supposed to go. We didn't expect it to go that way. He's not going to give the vineyard. He's not going to give the promises of the Old Testament to somebody else. He's not going to give salvation to somebody besides his chosen people, is he? Surely not. It's the same words that Paul uses when he's trying to set up this didactic response to some statement that he disagrees with, right? He uses it over and over again in the Pauline epistles. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Romans 6. What's Paul's answer? No, right? May it never be, right? Certainly not. Same words used here. Meganoito. Surely not. May that never be. I.e., may your plan for what's going to happen never be. This intense misunderstanding, even on behalf of the people. Now, Luke's pretty harsh on the religious leadership, but he's also harsh on those who see and hear and are around the person of Jesus and reject him. Still scream, "Crucify him." Refuse to believe. Even this misunderstanding and selfishness cannot thwart the purpose of God. Even a flat-out rejection. Simeon in Luke chapter 2 is going to foretell this type of language when he says this child is set for the fall and rising of many in Israel. This is actually the third time that Luke has used this psalm. He's alluding to a psalm when he uses this stone-type imagery. And the early church latched on to this idea of Christ as the cornerstone, the stone by which all other walls in the building or edifice are judged. The first one that is laid, the one that is the measuring block for everything that happens after that, the cornerstone, is the one who was rejected. As if the builders were going about choosing the stones from this pile of rocks and saying, this one's no good. That's the one that was used to measure everything else. Third time that Luke refers to it, it's Psalm 118. You'll recognize it by the time we get to the end of this section of it. Psalm 118, 19 through 24. Open to me the gates of righteousness that I might enter through them and give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous shall enter through it. I thank you that you have answered me and have become my salvation. Verse 22, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. Here's the part you know. This is the day that the Lord has made. Finish it. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Because the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Because something we did not expect to happen has happened outside of ourselves, outside of our merit. God has chosen to act and move in history to save you in spite of yourself. Let us rejoice. Because this is the day that the Lord has made. This is the purpose that the Lord has had since the beginning of time. This unexpected sovereignty, this idea of Christ as judge of all things. The rejected stone that you tried to crush will be your undoing. If anyone tries to fall on it, attack it, they will be the ones that break. Leading to these end times proclamations that happen in verse 20, we talk about the resurrection in chapter 20, at the end of chapter 20. And chapter 21, there are all these sections about wars and persecution and the destruction of the temple, destruction of Jerusalem, talking about the authority by which he has to even say these things is the fact that I was sent by the Father. This was the plan since the beginning of time, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. So he's proved his authority. He's shown it's all part of God's loving plan for our salvation, even though it's the parable of the wicked tenants. He's talking about what's wrong with their religious lives. It's not the end of the story because the Son has come. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. God's glory is revealed, and it's revealed in your salvation. And so we have a response. God calls us to faithfulness. You could say fruitfulness, if we're keeping with the vineyard imagery. God calls us to this faithfulness in terms of both justice and righteousness, in right action that leads to justice in the world, and righteousness that comes from faith, not from our own merit, not from anything that we deserve, is undeserved, is clothed in the righteousness of God because of the beloved Son, the Son that was sent for us. Over and over again in the Old Testament, Israel is described in this vineyard-type language. Here it's connected to the temple and those involved in temple worship because things have gone awry, things have gone wrong. We've already heard Jesus' judgment against what's going on, some of the things that are going on in the temple. Now we're going to hear the judgment of both those who are leading and those who are being led away from right relationship with God. See, there's going to be this leadership transfer. Matthew goes a little further than Luke and says the vineyard will be given to the fruitful people, to those producing fruit through faith and obedience. This is the thing that they say surely not to. The end of verse 16. He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. He will give it to those who have come after you. To Jesus, to the apostles, to even Gentile leaders of the New Testament church that would have blown the mind of Jewish religious leadership of the time. In fact, it results in all of this infighting in the early church. Because of this misunderstanding, this rejection, God will continually pursue those who respond in faith. And so what shall the owner do? This question leads us to question, what is the fruit of the vineyard expected to be? What is the owner that lends out this land to tenants, which is a common practice in the first century, lending out to tenants, leaving for a number of years that were able to produce the desired fruitfulness of the vineyard. It's not just, hey, take care of this for a while. Feed the cat. I expect you to make this vineyard fruitful when I return. And so what is the fruitfulness that the owner of the vineyard expects to see when he returns? That is, what is the fruitfulness of Old Testament Israel? What is that intended to be? And what is the fruitfulness of the temple? What is the actual purpose of the temple that when Jesus gets there, he does not see? Well, to find that out, we have to go to Isaiah chapter 5, which most scholars and commentators connect to this parable. Isaiah 5 will go 1 through 7. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. And he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. This intense, personal, intimate tilling and clearing out of land for the purpose of fruitfulness happening, intending to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes, undesirable fruit. Verse 3, and now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste, it shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. Now, this is the Old Testament connection to Israel being seen as the vineyard. And the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And here's what he looks for. Isaiah 5:7b. And he looked for justice, but he didn't find that. He found bloodshed. Behold, bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but behold, an outcry. This cry of feeble victims in distress. Now, what's going on here in the Old Testament is some subtle wordplay. In Hebrew, the word justice sounds like this, mishpat. He looks for this, but he finds this. Bloodshed and oppression, mishpach. Very close, grammatically sounding almost exactly the same. He looks for righteousness, zedekah, but he finds outcry, ze'akah. And the reason why this parable is pointing to this passage from Isaiah is the fact that there are subtle differences in the way that the Pharisees go about their religious leadership. There are subtle differences in the way that the Jewish religious people of the time go about their relationship with God that might look from the outside a lot like what they're supposed to be doing. But there's something off. There's something a little bit different. There's something that's not seeking after the beloved Son, the rejected cornerstone, but seeking after self, seeking the praise and authority of men. That looks almost like it's supposed to look like, but it's still a little off. See, in Isaiah, this destruction applies to Jerusalem and affects the entire nation. But the nation is not destroyed, a remnant is preserved. In Luke, the destruction applies to these dishonest tenants, and leadership is given to someone else. This progression of God's revelation of his salvation history for you and for me. So what shall I do? Asked the vineyard keeper of Isaiah. Tear down the walls of protection and destroy. What shall I do? Asks the owner of Luke 20. I shall send my beloved Son, even though the result of my sending is his death. My beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased to send and to die for those wicked tenants, for those who would reject the stone, for those who would seek after man and man's righteousness over being clothed in the righteousness of God. The turn of the century, the Osage Nation was forcibly moved by the United States government from Kansas, which was their tribal ground before that, to Oklahoma, reservation in Oklahoma. Osage chief was recorded as saying, perhaps now that they've put us in this rocky, fruitless, barren land in Oklahoma, they'll leave us alone. Some of you are laughing because you know what happened next. Black gold from the ground. We struck oil in Oklahoma. Where? Smack dab in the middle of the Osage Reservation. Now, I've actually been to the Osage Reservation. My grandfather has enough Osage blood in him to have actually signed the Constitution. And so we went and we looked at some of these pictures of the Osage Nation from the turn of the century. In 1907, they made tribal allotments based on the fact that so much oil was coming out of the Osage Reservation. And you had to be there in 1907 to get your allotment, and your allotment was ascribed to your family name. And you were given what's called head rights over the land. And so they literally went from living in teepees and native tribal ways and longhouses to driving cars and having mansions and wearing top hats and walking down the street with canes like the Monopoly guy. And the nation was stunned, right? It was, they were per capita immediately the most wealthy people group in America. $430 million by today's standards. And so the head rights became very, very important, and the head rights could only be transferred to somebody in your immediate family or to someone their benevolent government had set above them. White, wealthy, landowning guardians. We'll take care of your money. Don't you worry about that. The Osage murders, as they're now called, from 1921 to 1925, 60 people were shot, stabbed, poisoned, blown up in their homes. This is real. Actual bombs were placed in people's homes so that their guardians could get their head rights. You see, head rights multiplied. This is a family. This is Molly Burkhart and Anna Brown and their mother, Lizzie. Molly Burkhart's sister had already succumbed to this wasting illness that they didn't know at the time was poisoning. Her sister had been poisoned. Her mother was being poisoned, would eventually die for it. Anna Brown was shot. And so Molly Burkhart had 4 head rights transferred to her. Became one of the wealthiest single Osage. And so her guardians, her white husband and his uncle, that seemingly appeared out of nowhere, began to poison her. The ones set up to guard, to look out for, to protect, had looked out continually for their own interests. If you go to the Osage Museum and you talk to the ladies who curate it, there's a section of a picture of the Osage that is cut out. This is from David Grand's book, but I and my family have stood in that museum and talked to these ladies. But it's from David Grand's book, Killers of the Flower Moon. Now, there's a section of that picture that's cut out. And you ask them why, they'll say it's because the devil stood there. It was the man that was responsible for protecting them. The self-proclaimed king of the Osage Hills that was the architect of so many of their deaths. The book is called Killers of the Flower Moon because the Osage have a legend about the May moon that gets so bright. Overnight, the larger flowers, the black-eyed Susans and others, rise up above the smaller flowers. And they take all the light for themselves. And you walk out one morning and it looks like there's just confetti all over the ground. Because the smaller flowers who can't get to the light, who have been robbed of that sustenance, die. Our call is to faithfulness. When the owner of the vineyard comes to inspect our fruitfulness, our spiritual vineyards, what will he find? The fruit that he expects is justice and mercy and righteousness that comes not from ticking off dots on a page, but righteousness that comes from connection to his Son. From recreation, reality being changed within us, That type of fruitfulness, that type of movement towards the purposes of God and away from the purposes of man. When our vineyard is inspected, what will the owner find?